derivatives in the back room and whipping out your computer.
That's good to hear.
Right? I don't mean that. I just mean so many of these things are actually far more transparent than you could ever believe.
Right. Right. I want to go to the audience. We've got a full crowd here. Make sure that we leave time for those questions. Are there folks out here that have questions for John? Yes, ma'am. Front row and then second row.
So I'm curious, do you believe that people should disclose the data that they've used to produce the statistics that they publish? For instance, the way we do in actual publications where we peer review that data. Something like a nutrition label for data.
So the question is, should we require sort of full disclosure, a nutrition label for data, so that as people put it out, they explain where it came from?
Look, I think people should be able to fully explain the data. Of course, there's some proprietary data sets that make it a little bit harder. There's a lot of time that's sometimes spent by companies to build these complicated data sets. So I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say, well, every data set should be open to everyone. But I do think critical questioning, probing, and full disclosure of what the content was, that should absolutely happen. Sample sizes, absolutely agree. I mean, we had a situation where we were writing the book, and this didn't make the book because I didn't want to end up in a legal battle. But we had a situation in the book where we found a unnamed entity that we found on the website was making a representation about something in one of their products. And so we said, well, we found the same representation made by 3 other products, and we sent them, my co-author sent them an email, got a very nice letter from their general counsel informing us they had removed it from their website, but they would, take further legal action if we chose to put it in our book. Now, if I was being really difficult, we could have, but the point was,
because what you want to do is spend more time
right,
in
exactly.
court.
I'd love to spend more time in a courtroom. But the point is, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, what's the source?
Yeah. Okay. Ma'am, in the second row.
This is kind of a long question, but America's demographic is changing, and the baby boomers who have been in charge all along are kind of feeling disenfranchised now because of the changing demographic. And we could fast forward 50 years and look back at building a wall between the United States and Mexico and juxtapose that image with the Statue of Liberty as two opposing images to define the xenophobic nature of American evolution. But right now, a wall seems like a really good idea, even though I work for the State Department and I know it's not going to make one bit of difference whatsoever. So sometimes it's pull, not push. Right? That is, a lot of Americans right now are liking this idea of the wall.
But is there a stats or data question there? I'm sorry, I'm not getting that aspect.
That is, when you are communicating with the American public, sometimes it's what they want to hear, not what the data actually shows.
All right, well, so I think what I can say about that is one of the things we talk about a little bit in the book is that one of the changes that's occurred with the sort of large-scale media, with there's so many sources, is that people can have their preconceived notions reinforced because there's always a place they can go where they can get the view they want to hear. And so one of the things we try to talk a lot about in our book is that that's a tendency we really should try to avoid. And when you think about the fact, as I said, I was talking about the global warming example, which is a very simple one, people can manipulate statistics to sort of reinforce their own biases, right? I come back to objective thinking says we're going to try to look at the data in a more objective fashion. And, I don't have a solution to how I can change people that have strongly held beliefs and say, well, you're not going to believe the data. But I do think the more we can educate our current generation, the more we can educate people in a more open-minded way about data. And we do have a whole generation of, my kids' generation who are all into numbers and data a lot more comfortable. That is a real opportunity for us to sort of think about, all right, here's how we can raise the level of debate. When I sort of stay out of politics because that's not a place that I want to be. But I do think that the notion of raising the level of the debate is something that we can collectively agree on, and sort of statistical literacy is one part of that.
You touched on something there I wanted to ask about, and the different sort of generational question of, are people, we have digital natives now, but are they having that same sort of native comfort with data, or are they just accepting it unquestionably? Do you notice a distinct difference between what, we have kids who are middle school age, but what students today versus 20-year-olds versus folks who are 40, 50, 60, how they interpret and are able to accurately process the data?
Look, I think that what I have found, at least, and I don't have any broad-reaching studies, so this is truly impressionistic,
Yeah.
and anecdote,
So
the plural of
we'll talk
anecdote
sample
is
size
not
here,
data.
yeah.
But the point is, but what I have found generally is when I've been doing my book tour, I've spoken at some high schools, I've spoken at some universities, I've spoken at audiences like this. I mean, I've hit quite a wide audience, and I will say that the high schoolers have been incredibly excited and have grasped it very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So for what that's worth, my anecdotal evidence is, I'm actually really encouraged by that. They're not afraid to have the discussion about the average being misleading. They may not know how to interpret it, they may not have the patience or the wherewithal to pay attention, but they're not afraid.
Okay.
And so I sort of feel like if we can get rid of some of the fear, at least around numbers and statistics, and I guess that's the generational, when I talk to some other generations where there's a little bit of just pure fear, like, I remember math class, which was unpleasant, and, think of a ruler wrapping on their hands or something, so I think that's part of it.
Right. Well, I mean, I like data, and when you say derivatives, I flinch. So it's other questions from the audience. Yes, ma'am, back there, and then you, sir. Yeah, you. Yes. Okay.
There is there is, yes, I'm glad you noticed. I have 3 orange ties that I wear often. My wife tells me when I do my little videos and when I do things, it's good. So, yes.
Sorry. And your second question,
That's
ma'am?
causal.
Second question is, as a data person, if you're talking about literacy, would it be a good idea for like CNN, Fox, and have to use posing it to them? But they have data analysts that specialize in presenting data charts that show the difference in the same data. In other words, if you're going to show a chart, make sure they're showing it very
Yeah.
An interesting question, whether we should try and get more providers of data, particularly more media providers of data, to slice and dice the data and present it in multiple ways. Much as you were saying, you could take that data.
Look,
and
I would
chart
love
anything you
that
want.
personally. I mean, again, I think that could be very valuable. I think the issue is, I always joke, when somebody hears that I'm an MIT-trained econometrician, they're like, well, this guy's going to be really interesting to listen to, right? So I do think if you can have the right message, the right messaging, that's a really valuable thing. I mean, we've had a really, hopefully, an interesting discussion today about these types of issues, and I do think, again, coming back to, there is a whole movement in journalism called data-driven journalism right now, and they are, whether it's from Nate Silver, 538.com, there is some of that, but I do think there's a lot more room for just the pure equivalent of the fact-checking that you see sort of in political statements, the same with statistics and data more generally. If that role of the media being educating as opposed to being either manipulating or advocating, and again, that's not meant, but if you can have that educational role, I think that is a really valuable function.
There's a great blog out there called Junk Charts that I find very valuable. Does exactly what you're talking about, of just spotlights, and doesn't necessarily present it in multiple ways, but will take the data and critique it and point out where interesting is the polite way to put it.
Well, and
Interesting
I will
presentations come
say,
together.
Troy, that one of the things I do, I don't know if there'll be a second book or not, but I have a blog where I also every week pick a news story that I explain what's wrong with the data. And I'm going to be in business for a long time doing that. I mean, there's no lack of things to find to talk about. And I also call out things that are well done.
Yeah.
I don't just sort of pick on people. I try to be a little bit more uplifting and empowering. This is not just, all the bad in the world. There are people that are trying really hard to get it right, but we've got to kind of get more people thinking that way to actually do it.
And while we're in shameless shout-out mode, the blog is where?
Oh, it's on my website, johnhjohnsonphd.com.
Excellent. We will be sure to feature
Thank
it
you.
on fcw.com. You can go and we'll point you right there. Yes, sir.
So, do studies show that people who read this book take the time to absorb and understand the data, and they have a better role in prioritizing the data they have to consume during the day?
This is the good cross-examination question of,
Well-
have you run the data to show if reading this book actually makes you better at understanding the data?
I have been speaking so much about the book, I haven't run any data on that. Once again, I don't have hard evidence yet. What I have is a lot of positive feedback on the book. So one of the things that was really important to my co-author and I when we wrote it, though, was that we actually do build into the book what we call how to be a better consumer of data. At the end of every chapter, we have these 4 or 5 guidelines that we give on averaging, on cherry picking, that really do give practical guidance to people. I mean, it was very important to us, and hopefully you can sense from my tone, you know, the educational component of this is a very important piece to me. That's sort of where my passion comes for this. It's sort of so it is important that people leave and not just say, well, we heard this interesting story about the space shuttle, or boy, that A&W hamburger story, that's crazy. But also, how do I be better wired? And so hopefully those tips at a minimum is advancing that. I guess the audience will let me know, but I hope so. Well, yeah, so look, I struggle with this, right? And I'm not going to pretend that my book can sort of give you everything, but